Greetings, friends, and welcome back to the podcast of Jewish Ideas, a Torah in Motion production. I'm JJ Kimchi. Every history of Jewish thought will at some point declare Hermann Cohen to be one of the most important and influential of the modern Jewish philosophers. Cohen, who lived in Germany during the 19th and early 20th centuries, was a rare intellectual, a true giant both in the wider world of academic philosophy and in the narrower arena of Jewish thought. His ideas concerning God, religion, and ethics, among many other topics, were a major influence upon Jewish thinkers in subsequent generations, and he remains a significant subject of discussion among intellectual historians today. Joining us to illuminate the rather complex and opaque labyrinth of Cohen's ideas is Dr. Shira Billet, who is an assistant professor of Jewish thought and ethics at the Jewish Theological Seminary in New York. Professor Billet wrote her doctorate at Princeton University in the thought of Hermann Cohen and completed postdoctoral studies at Yale, and has since published widely in the field of modern Jewish thought in general and on Hermann Cohen in particular. It is a privilege to welcome Professor Billet to the podcast of Jewish Ideas today. Professor, welcome.
Thank you so much, JJ, for having me on the podcast. Pleasure to be here.
Excellent. So let's dive in. There's much to cover. So first, if you can, perhaps give us a brief outline of Cohen's biography. When did he live? Where did he live? What were the social, political circumstances in which he worked? Also, I'm interested if you could touch a little bit on his Jewishness and to what extent he was involved and engaged in the Jewish life during his lifetime.
Sure. So Cohen was born in 1842 and he died in 1918. Just towards the end of World War I was his death. He lived his entire life in the borders of contemporary Germany, although German unification didn't happen until he was around 30 years old. He grew up in a small town in Germany called Coswig, which was a typical kind of small town where there were very few families in general. Cohen's family was one of only two Jewish families, and there weren't that many other families as well. But it was an interesting place to grow up. And so I'll touch on kind of Jewishly and other things through talking a little bit about his upbringing here. His father was a chazan, a cantor, leader of prayer services, and he was also a local Jewish school teacher, and he was a very educated and erudite Jew, and he educated his son Jewishly in terms of traditional study, Bible, Talmud, etc. But it was also this small town where they did not have enough people for a daily minyan. They always had a minyan in holidays and things like that. And they sought to forge ties with any Jews in the area. They were constantly hosting Jewish families passing through the neighborhood. Cohen writes about this very eloquently later in his life, childhood memories of Shabbat meals, where they would kind of pray for strangers to be passing through the neighborhood and enjoy encountering Jews from anywhere. At the same time, his family was staunchly German patriotic, and he was raised a German patriot. His upbringing was in this town that was quite ecumenical in the sense that Jews and Christians got along really well. His father was a respected figure in the neighborhood, and Cohen really was raised with a sense of a kind of positive Jewish-Christian encounter, which was not necessarily typical for all Jews in his lifetime, but it was a nice moment for Jews in the place where Cohen lived and in that area. After he studied at a German gymnasium, which is a kind of high school with a traditional German curriculum, where he also came home on weekends and continued his traditional Torah study with his father, he then went off to study at the Jewish Theological Seminary in Breslau, which was run by Zachariah Frankel. It was a rabbinical seminary, and it was also a place of academic Jewish studies, Wissenschaft des Judentums, but in this space that Zachariah Frankel occupied, which was not going so far in the direction of reform, which was becoming influential in that time, but also not quite orthodox. And so in this middle space that Frankel was occupying, Cohen studied there, and he was very influenced by the courses that he took at that time, but he ultimately left. He did not want to become a rabbi. He was interested in philosophy, and he left after 4 years to study at a German university, where he went and became a philosopher, studied philosophy, and he wrote a doctoral dissertation in philosophy, and he ultimately, this was all in the 1860s, not long after that, he wrote a book, his first major book, which was a commentary, a philosophical commentary on Kant's Critique of Pure Reason. And this book came out in 1871 and it made a big splash. The reception of this book will help us understand Cohen's later career. So I'll just say in brief that through the publication of this book, Cohen came to the attention of lots of people, but one who was really important for the subsequent trajectory of his life was Friedrich Albert Lange, who was a German philosopher and a sociologist, although in that time it was a branch of philosophy, thinking about social thought, thinking about political thought. And Lange was very interested and intrigued by Cohen's work on Kant, and he ultimately brought Cohen to the University of Marburg, where he taught. And he got Cohen a position there. And then he began to kind of tirelessly advocate for Cohen to have a secure permanent position, like kind of like tenure in the United States. It was a little different, works differently in the German system. But Lange was not successful in this endeavor, primarily because Cohen was Jewish. And Jews were really just excluded from the upper echelons of the profession at this time. There were no full professors of philosophy who were Jews unless they had baptized, that is, converted to Christianity. So this didn't work. But then in 1875, Lange died unexpectedly. And while his colleagues were mourning the loss of their beloved colleague, they were moved to grant the wish that he had been fighting for, which was to get Cohen hired. And it was in that moment that Cohen became a full professor. And it was such a unique moment that it's just relevant to note that Cohen was the only practicing is not really relevant here, but just professed Jew, meaning someone who remained a Jew, who occupied such a high level position in philosophy through the entire era of the Kaiserreich, or the German Empire, from 1871 unification until World War I. So it was a pretty unique position, and it was a precarious one. Cohen had to be really careful. There were a lot of people who didn't like a Jew being in this position, and the safest bet was to downplay his Judaism and focus on being a philosopher. But this did not work out very well, because by the end of the 1870s, so just a couple of years after Cohen began in this position, there was a real shift in the winds. I mentioned his upbringing with this kind of very positive Jewish and Christian interaction. But by the end of the 1870s, anti-Semitism becomes really significant, not just in Germany, but throughout Europe and other places in the world. But for our purposes, what was going on in Germany is the most relevant here. And it became impossible for Cohen to kind of avoid focusing on his Jewishness, because he felt that he was in a unique position, given his unique role as a German philosopher, to defend the Jews. And so he begins to do this at the beginning of this in around 1880. I'm happy to go into more details on any of this if you're interested, but this becomes even more significant later, especially in his local town where the university was. There was this fascinating trial in 1888, which had to do with anti-Semitism, where it had been at this anti-Semitic political rally for a figure named Otto Buckel, who was a politician whose primary part of his platform was anti-Semitism. And he had ties to the university. He had attended the university as a student, and there was a rally for him there. And some people had said some really negative things about Judaism, especially claiming that the Talmud demanded that Jews behave unethically towards Gentiles, and that Jews, because they followed the Talmud, were just basically unethical people. And the Jewish community sued this teacher. It was a teacher who had made that statement at this public rally for slandering one of the recognized religions. And Cohen was called by the court to serve as the expert witness on the Jewish side. So it's a very strange job. He basically has to talk about whether the Talmud is unethical or ethical in order to determine whether this person had really spoken in a slanderous way. And so Cohen took on this public role talking about the ethics of Judaism in the courtroom. This was very upsetting to his colleagues, and he was really quite ostracized at the university after he took on this really public role in the context of this local drama. So that is to say that he suffered in many ways, certainly socially and also professionally. But at the same time, we need to point out that while he was at Marburg, he founded the Marburg School of Neo-Kantianism, which was a really prominent and significant philosophical intellectual movement within Germany in this time. He attracted many students to the department, and he really became a very prominent figure on the philosophical scene in Germany at this time. And of course, as he attracted many students and admirers, he also attracted many critics. Obviously, criticism comes in many flavors. There are lots of substantive critiques of Cohen's thought, which are perfectly valid and important. And some of his critics also focused on his Jewishness and accused his neo-Kantianism of Judaizing philosophy. So there's different flavors here. In terms of what you asked about his Jewish practice, so it's hard to get at this perfectly clearly, but I would say that it's very clear that he was a proud and committed Jew. He obviously, at great personal cost, took the charge of defending the Jewish community in the context of this rise in anti-Semitism from the 1880s and onward. It's also clear from his writings where he talks about Judaism that the Siddur and the Machzor, that is like the daily prayer book and the prayer books for the holidays and the high holidays, were extremely important Jewish texts for him. So it's very clear that he connected deeply to prayer and liturgy. I already mentioned that his father was a chazan. So this is a big part of his life. He certainly was very traditional in many ways and certainly tried to observe many commandments. Earlier in his life, he was open to certain reforms. For example, shifting Shabbat to Sunday to allow Jews to observe their Sabbath on the same day that Christians observe their Sabbath. But this was really something that he toyed with in his youth. And later, he absolutely was not interested in these kinds of changes. And he became a pretty staunch advocate of preserving traditional Judaism without too many changes. Although one change he was very interested in was intellectually. He did believe in academic Jewish studies, Wissenschaft des Judentums, all this stuff, and not being extremely bound by traditional ideas in terms of how Jewish sources were studied. He also deeply admired the vitality of the Judaism that he saw in his students who came from the Russian Empire and Eastern Europe in general. And he actually went on a visit to Eastern Europe in 1913, where he was deeply moved by the practice of Jews there. And he thought that they had much more vitality in their Judaism than German Jews, but he also thought that German Jews had achieved a kind of level of scholarship and modernity that was also important. And he hoped to kind of bring together the vitality of Eastern European Jewry together with the kind of intellectual openness of German Judaism. So these are some of his beliefs. And one point I want to make about this is a nice quote from one of his students who was more traditional than he was, who kind of described Cohen as more liberal and open in certain ways that this student disagreed with. But he said at the same time that Cohen was such a deep lover of the Jewish people that he would have gone to the stake for the Shema Yisrael. So this is how his students perceived him. And the last thing I'll mention is just that while Cohen died in 1918, his wife was killed in Theresienstadt, by the Nazis in 1941. So this is a very sad kind of epilogue to, not just the fate of his wife, but in general, the fate of German Jews, to his strong belief in Germany as a place where Judaism really could thrive.
Interesting. Firstly, thank you. That was a fascinating overview of his life and times. I would say what was interesting, I suppose, among the many interesting things there, is that, for someone who lived a fairly, pedestrian, the kind of life that did not seek attention, did not seek controversy, his mere existence as the first full professor of philosophy in a serious German university, and as a professing Jew, just living with those identities was a huge statement. And of course, we all know that in the decades afterwards, German Jewish history would come to a very tragic, a very violent end. But still, it is important to note that Germany was, at the time, the global center, or a major global center of intellectual activity. And the fact that he sort of broke that glass ceiling, as it were, becoming the first Jew and a serious philosopher, was very significant indeed. So let's move into his intellectual biography a little bit. And the first thing I'm going to ask you is something, I suppose, a little bit unfair, which is that you mentioned he was a very important neo-Kantian philosopher. And, we only have a very limited time here, so you cannot possibly explain all of what that would mean and how Cohen interpreted Kant and updated him and, presented his philosophy anew, as it were. But just in terms of understanding his Jewish writings, he had a sort of general philosophical writings and he also had his Jewish writings. So let me ask you the following. In order to understand his Jewish writings and his Jewish ideas, what particular elements, let's say, of his Neo-Kantian philosophy must one understand? Or what principles ought we have in mind before reading Cohen and trying to understand Cohen from his general philosophy?
Okay, so I'm laughing because, as you mentioned, it's a huge topic and we couldn't possibly cover it in any way that's sufficient, that is. And I'll just mention that Cohen, not only did he write 3 books that were commentaries on Kant, I spoke about the first one before, but he wrote 2 others as well. And then he also wrote his own philosophical system, which was a Neo-Kantian philosophical system that also contained 3 huge books that were Neo-Kantian. These were not commentaries on Kant. So there's obviously a ton of Kant that was important to Cohen. And Kant and Cohen are both notoriously difficult thinkers. But still, I do think we can distill a few key points that are important here. And so I'll try to do that. And I hope I'll be clear, but also please, stop me to clarify further. Okay, so one thing that's really important to know about Kant that was important to Cohen, not just for Cohen's Jewish philosophy, but also for his Jewish philosophy, was just the notion of philosophy as a science and the importance of scientific method and the commitment to scientific method in doing philosophy. This is really central to Kant's critique of pure reason, especially if you read the second edition of it. It's there in the first as well, but it's really pronounced. Like, for example, if you read the preface and the introduction to the second edition of Kant's Critique of Pure Reason, and this commitment to science, philosophy as science, was deeply important for Cohen. And I'll try to say a little bit more in a moment about how that's relevant to some of his Jewish thought. The other thing that's really important is the term, I should say, idealism. And now I just want to be clear that when I say idealism, this is not like our kind of popular use of this term that someone's an idealist, meaning they love justice or making the world better, even though Cohen did actually love those things and care about those things. But here I'm talking about idealism in the kind of philosophical sense of the term, which is itself a complex topic. So to keep it as simple as possible, philosophical idealism is a kind of rationalism. It reflects a belief that the mind, the work of the mind and of thinking and things that we're doing just in our own minds as we're working through ideas, that these play a hugely central role to our ability to access and know truth. Okay, there are some very extreme forms of this. For example, the English philosopher Berkeley, famous statement, esse est percipi, to be is to be perceived, which is viewed as this really extreme idealism, which seems to kind of deny the reality of the world outside of the mind. Obviously, all thinkers are more complicated than the most extreme forms of them, so I'll just leave that aside. And I'll say that there are we might think this is crazy. There are, though, some really compelling reasons why people might want to subscribe to versions of this philosophy. And the most significant of it is just the idea of how can we know things? There are these questions like, how do we know that anything that we perceive outside of us is really how it is, or whether we're seeing some fake version of it, whether it's all kind of tricks happening in our minds, some simulation. So these are questions about how secure our knowledge is. And there are strong reasons why we would want to give human thought a significant role. So Kant cares about this. He wants to give human thought a significant role because he wants our knowledge to be secure. At the same time, Kant is really compelled by certain critiques of these views coming from empiricist figures like David Hume, for example, who was very influential on Kant and who was really skeptical about how much we really know, about how much access we have, that is, to a secure knowledge. So Kant was trying to preserve rationalism while also responding to Hume's critique, which he took very seriously. And Cohen also, in the vein of Kant, wants to preserve a compelling philosophical rationalism. But like Kant also, he wants it to be scientifically grounded. He wants it to respond to criticisms. And so Cohen's idealism, he calls it critical idealism, which is to give it a sense of both that he's influenced by Kant's critique of pure reason. That word critical comes from critique in Kant's work. And so, again, really complex topic, but for our purpose, it's about finding a way to securely ground the work that the human mind does through thinking and reasoning as a very significant part of a compelling story of how we access truth. So there's a lot more to say about this. The last thing I'll mention about idealism, though, which is important for our understanding of Cohen, is that Cohen traces the term idealism back to Plato, the ancient Greek philosopher. And here he focuses on the Greek term, which is the term for the forms. So if listeners are familiar with Plato's theory of the forms, for example, if you look at the term in Greek, it would be better translated as Plato's theory of the ideas. And in fact, in German, it does maintain this. So it's the theory of the ideas in German, not the theory of the forms, which is how we typically refer to it in English translations. In any case, Plato is a really important figure, and Cohen's has a kind of unique understanding of Plato's forms, which he understands not really as like metaphysical entities out there in the sky that are the most perfect version of things that we see here on Earth, which is obviously a very reductive and not correct description of Plato either. But he sees them as kinds of like hypotheses that are part of the scientific method that help us achieve the most perfect form of our ideas and our knowledge over time. So again, really complicated topic, but Cohen very carefully read Plato in the original Greek and looked at all the places where he talks about these forms or ideas, and it was part of that philosophical commentary that he came up with this understanding of Plato, and he saw Kant as very much taking up this tradition. So I hope that part of the discussion didn't do more harm than good in terms of keeping us understanding what is useful about Kant for Cohen. The last thing I'll say, which I think is the easiest to understand, is ethics. Kant really cared about ethics. It was very central to his thought. In fact, it was very central to his desire to preserve a kind of philosophical rationalism that I was mentioning before when I was talking about idealism, was because Kant cared about this for ethics. He really worried that without some kind of secure rationalism, we couldn't really have a secure philosophical ethics. We might become skeptics about ethics. We might think that what is ethical, that is to say, what is good, what is the right way to behave in the world? Well, look at nature. It's however nature acts. And that might lead us to a kind of might makes right philosophy, where we see how the animals that are higher up in the food chain eat the animals that are lower down and things like that, where it's kind of like whoever can survive, survival of the fittest. That's what it looks like in nature. But if we want to have an ethics that is beyond that asks us to sometimes give up on our self-interest for the sake of the human other and things like that, which was very important for Kantian ethics, we needed to have a kind of philosophical rationalism. So, and here God plays a very important role in grounding the possibility of ethics. And so these ideas about God and ethics are also extremely important for Cohen's Jewish philosophy. But in any case, it's related to his desire to ground thought in rationalism and in the scientific aspect of philosophy that I mentioned as well.
So this is a fascinating element, and I do want to drill a little bit deep into it, because it seems to me that this is a good point of departure for talking a bit about Cohen in general, because, and again, correct me if I've got this slightly wrong, but in the Kantian worldview, God himself, the idea of God, is primarily, let's say, an outworking of the ethical system. In other words, an ethical system grounded in rationality, and as part of that, or within that conversation, that is the starting point for talking about something eternal, something divine, something transcendent, etc. So let's turn into Cohen's idea of this. I mean, for Cohen, what was the correct understanding of the relationship, let's say, between ethics and God, or specifically ethics and the Jewish religion? Where would he fasten that particular clasp between those two areas of thought?
Okay, so again, this is probably I shouldn't keep saying this, but every topic we're going to address probably is extremely complicated. And so, again, I'll try to respond to your excellent question in a way that's necessarily kind of limited. So, I already mentioned the idea that when we look at nature, and if that's the only part of the world that is relevant to us, it's very hard to get at the kind of ethics that Kant and Cohen are interested in. There's an important distinction to bring into this is the idea that there is what is, and then there's the question of what ought to be. And can we derive from what there is, which is to say nature, what there ought to be, which is a kind of ethical norm that is telling us to do something that's different from what we just derive from nature. So this was an important question for Kant and for Cohen. And Judaism and the idea of God were important for Cohen in the sources of how he comes to his neo-Kantian view of this matter. So a few things that I think are important that I'll touch on again with the caveat that this is just extremely limited. So one thing is that Cohen thought that monotheism, the idea that there is one God, which he saw as Judaism's crucial philosophical contribution to human thought in history, that this was a central ethical insight because if there was one God, then there was also one humanity. One God for one humanity is a kind of central principle of Cohen's thought. Without the idea of one God, you might also think that there were lots of different human beings who had different origins, and maybe not all of them were fully equal to one another. And certainly in the kind of 19th century popular like racial scientific ideas, which are now known to be pseudoscience, but at the time these were very compelling scientific work. Some theories abounded that argued for a kind of polygenesis of human beings, that humans of different races actually did not originate from one common ancestor. And this kind of justified thinking about human inequality as quite natural. So for Cohen, monotheism played a central role in denying these kinds of ideas. That if there's one God, there's one humanity, which means that humans are all fundamentally equal at core, created in the image of God, a biblical idea that he valued very much. And this could be the basis of a universal ethics. And Cohen thought that ethics had to be universal at core, meaning it had to include the insight that all human beings were equal, because Cohen thought that without this insight, we would never really go past caring for our families, our neighbors, our loved ones, the people that we know, our own nation, to caring about other human beings beyond us. But he felt that ethics really required the idea that we fundamentally believed in the equality of all human beings and used that as a motivation to believe that we were obligated to behave ethically towards everyone. So again, monotheism, which he saw as Judaism's contribution, was central to this. On the other pole of Jewish thought's contribution, Cohen thought that the idea of the Messianic age, as it appears in the prophetic books of the Tanakh, of the Old Testament, the Bible, Hebrew Bible, the idea of the Messianic age was also a central idea, where the prophets describe the coming together of all of humanity from the quote unquote four corners of the world. Cohen saw this basically as the ideal towards which Judaism aspires, which is it begins with the belief in the one God who is the father of the one humanity, so to speak. And then it kind of culminates in the imperative to strive towards creating that world, bringing in that messianic age when all of humanity comes together once again. So again, Cohen saw these as crucial Jewish insights to ethics, the belief in God's transcendence, which was very important for Kant. And maybe we'll talk about that a little bit later when we talk about Cohen's relationship to Spinoza. So I'll leave that for now, that the importance of the transcendent God. So that was one idea, but these other ideas from Judaism were very important to Cohen's ethics. And one thing that I'll add, though, is that Cohen's major book on ethics, which was his book Ethics of the Pure Will, which he first published in 1904, that book was not a Jewish book. It was a philosophical book, but he does mention the prophets in certain key places. And it's clear that Jewish ideas really animated the book. But one thing that Cohen really thought was important in that book was not just the origins of these ideas in ancient Jewish thought, but how everyone was working together to work these ideas out. Jews working hand in hand with everybody else. And in Cohen's Ethics, he also articulates a political theory. It's also his book on politics. And Cohen saw the modern idea of the nation state, and in particular, the place of the Jews in it, because he's living in the 19th century where Jewish emancipation, that is, Jews are gaining civil rights in all of these European countries over the course of the 19th century. And he sees this idea of the nation state, which gives citizenship to all of its people, including people of different religious and ethnic backgrounds. Cohen sees this as a kind of stepping stone towards this ever working out messianic idea of Judaism. So again, he sees the state where it's not just one ethnicity and one nation, but rather a kind of multinational state as an example in the here and now of humanity coming together under one umbrella, but that's within the state. There are still multiple states that are at war with each other. And of course, by the end of his life, he experiences the horrors of World War I. But he hopes that from the nation state, there could become a kind of federation of states that would really bring together all of humanity and again, become a closer step towards this Jewish messianic vision, which he saw as possibly working out in political theory. Of course, all of this kind of looks very, perhaps naive is the word, or just a little too optimistic from here. But you have to also understand how exciting it was to witness Jewish emancipation and to see the possibilities of a better future that were imaginable in that time. And so that also is part of what went into his ethical thought, his political thought, and the role that Judaism played in it.
That's fascinating. Although it is worth noting for our listeners as well that Cohen was very much not a Zionist. That he, if I'm not mistaken, he was alive during the early decades of the Zionist movement, and saw fit to distance himself from that, which is well, perhaps a discussion we can have another time because there's much more to discuss.
Well, I'll just say for a second that I'm actually happy to discuss a little bit about that, but
Sure.
I think we're going to talk later about his relationship to Spinoza, and I
Yes.
think that will be a place where it will be the easiest to talk about why Cohen really struggled with early Zionist ideas, which he did oppose. Now, you have to keep in mind that he died in 1918, so he died well before the kind of instantiation of Zionism that we know today and the dominance of political Zionism. And of course, he died before the Holocaust and he died before the founding of the State of Israel. And so we always have to think about his opposition to Zionism in that historical context of early Zionist ideas. But still, I think we can talk about it a little bit perhaps when we talk about Spinoza.
We'll do that. Before we get there, though, there's one or two other topics within sort of the world of Jewish thought, and I want to get your understanding of Cohen's opinion on. One of them is revelation, and what exactly he understands by revelation, and how exactly he relates revelation to history. Because certainly the traditional understanding of revelation, divine revelation within the Jewish past, is that it was a moment in history, that it was something given at Sinai or wherever, or in the wilderness, and something direct from God to humankind. It took place very specific circumstances and under very specific conditions and to a specific people, etc. And there's a lot of ink has been shed on this particular topic. But Cohen sees it, if I'm not mistaken, somewhat differently. So could you perhaps walk us through what was Cohen's understanding of revelation?
Okay, great. So Cohen, we have to remember, was a philosopher, and
Right.
his understanding of God and his understanding of revelation, at least that he communicates in his written work, which is what we have access to, is philosophical. And so we have to understand it in that light, that he's a philosopher understanding these concepts philosophically. Okay, that's the aspect of revelation that he's engaging with in his work. And for Cohen, the essence of revelation, at least philosophically, lies in the idea that God enters into a relationship with the human being. That's how he puts it in his Religion of Reason out of the Sources of Judaism. But immediately when he talks about God entering into a relationship with the human being, he wants to be very careful, because Cohen, as a philosopher, was actually very worried about discourse about God that didn't recognize God's complete transcendence over nature. Okay, so the moment we're talking about a relationship with human beings, we're bringing God into nature, and Cohen worries that this opens the door to certain kinds of philosophies about God that he labeled as pantheistic. Pantheism. It's a term that's kind of too complicated for us to get into here. There are so many debates about what it means, Cohen's use of it, but for our purposes, it's some kind of way of seeing God as immanent in this world and not completely transcendent. And for our purposes, we also want to understand why Cohen cares so much about this. Cohen was a Kantian, and he believed that in Kant's writings about ethics in particular, that human ethics as a philosophical endeavor, so meaning the ability to have a really rigorous and robust philosophical account of ethics, which would justify the idea that we ought to treat one another philosophically, that we ethically, that is, that we ought to go about in the world towards other human beings in an ethical manner rather than other ways we might interact with other human beings, like in ways that dominate or use other people or things like that. So Cohen thinks that philosophical ethics in the Kantian vein, which he thinks was the most successful model, relied on the idea of God's transcendence. And he thought that more immanent ideas about God created an ethics that was insufficient, an ethics that didn't fully justify that the notion that we should treat all human beings as ends unto themselves, the way that Kant puts it. Okay, so that's just a little bit of a super brief primer on why for Cohen, it's so philosophically important that God is transcendent. At the same time, we're talking about revelation, and revelation is God entering into a relationship with the human being. So there's a really careful balance that Cohen is going to want to strike between the idea that God's in relationship with human beings and the world, and the idea that God is still other, transcendent, above the world, which he sees as so philosophically important. Okay, so that's one point that I just want to make as a preface to talking about revelation. And then another point I want to make in a particularly Jewish context when we're thinking about Cohen's interpretation of Jewish revelation, right, which is what you were asking me about Matan Torah, the revelation at Sinai in the book of Exodus, and that kind of origin story and traditional understandings of it, and what is Cohen's relationship to that particular revelation, that kind of Jewish revelation. So in a Jewish context, something we need to keep in mind for understanding Cohen is the ways in which Cohen read traditional Jewish sources. So we have to remember, on the one hand, that he spent those 4 years that we talked about earlier studying at the Jewish Theological Seminary in Breslau, where he learned critical historical approaches to the study of traditional sacred Jewish texts, because that seminary was an institution of what was known in Germany at the time as Wissenschaft des Judentums, or the science of Judaism, the academic study of Judaism. So he was very much exposed to historical critical methods. So those are absolutely on the table for him when he's going to be interpreting traditional Jewish sources. At the same time, Cohen was not a historian in a strict sense. He was a philosopher. And there's a way in which philosophy enabled Cohen to actually be more of a traditionalist than a pure historian might be, because he was really opposed in a very deep way to the idea of only looking at ancient texts in some kind of human historical context as a human-made artifact of a specific moment in history, which is what a really strict historicist would do. Cohen believed that ancient texts communicate genuine philosophical truths that are eternal. And he believed that the eternity and the truthfulness that is contained in old and new sources, that wherever we have ideas that are eternally true, Cohen believes that those are grounded in some way within some idea of God, within a concept of God, within an idea of God, and therefore are connected in some way to revelation when we human beings have access to those ideas. So whenever we human beings know something that is eternally true, then in some sense we are entering into a relationship with God and experiencing some kind of revelation. Okay? But just like we see that in the very notion that there are eternal truths, that Cohen, the philosopher, is making space for certain components of traditional notions of revelation that are harder for a robust historian to sustain. At the same time, Cohen, the philosopher, is not a strict traditionalist at all by any metric. He's using historical methods. He's looking at the human sides of these sacred texts. And so we're going to want to think of Cohen as really trying to sustain an intellectually robust middle ground between a very rigid historical critical approach and what we might view on the other side as a very rigid, uncritical, unscientific traditionalism. He sees a very delicate balance between history and philosophy, and his understanding of revelation is found somewhere in there, in the way in which he sees eternally true ideas, that is, philosophically true ideas, communicated in history through traditional sources and the way that humans have interpreted them over time. And again, whatever is eternally true in them for Cohen is going to be grounded in some kind of relationship to God. So, as a philosopher, Cohen, we have to understand, is very concerned not with what's fundamentally mysterious. For example, like, how could there have been this moment when God abruptly entered into the world to reveal the Torah at Mount Sinai? For him, that would be fundamentally mysterious and fundamentally unknowable. Okay. And as a philosopher, Cohen is not interested really in those things. He's interested in what is knowable. He wants to know what we mortal, finite human beings can know. And so when he's thinking about revelation, again, the last thing he's going to really spend time discussing are these fundamentally unknowable mythical moments, right? Like what we find in the traditional understanding. But he's immediately interested in the human side, which is to say how this was received immediately and then throughout history by human beings once revelation, so to speak, passed into the hands of human beings. And Cohen makes much of the fact that there are two accounts of the giving of the Torah at Mount Sinai in the Torah itself. So that is the mythical, as he would put it, description in Exodus. And then there's the account given by Moses in Deuteronomy, which Cohen sees as a human account, as a human, a prophet, but a human remembering what happened and describing his own experience of that revelation. And Cohen focuses really on the fact that already within the Torah itself, we shift from Exodus to Deuteronomy. That is, we shift from the mythical to the human interpretation. And he discusses the ways in which the account in Deuteronomy focuses so deeply on what he sees as certain kind of philosophical tendencies, to focus on the idea that we didn't see any images, very Maimonidean, so to speak. Obviously, it's Deuteronomic, but the emphasis in Deuteronomy on you didn't see anything, you didn't see any image of God in Revelation. This is emphasized by Maimonides in his philosophical account, and this is emphasized by Cohen, who wants us to have an understanding of God, as I mentioned already, that is very much transcendent, very much beyond the natural world. And in general, because Cohen is interested in the human side, he's going to be interested in prophecy as a vehicle of revelation, much more than in the kind of unknowable moment of Sinai. And so he focuses a lot in his discussions on the prophetic books, and especially the Nevi'im Acharonim, the later prophets, like Yeshayahu, Yirmiyahu, Yechezkel, Isaiah, Jeremiah, and Ezekiel. And again, I mentioned already that whenever someone is communicating a genuine truth, that is in some sense grounded in God, and in some sense that's revelation. And so for Cohen, prophecy is divinely inspired to the extent that it's communicating genuine truth. But it's not divinely inspired in a way that's fundamentally different necessarily from excellent philosophical work. For example, the work of a great philosopher in history, such as Socrates, not a Jew, of course, who also claimed to be divinely inspired. And Cohen finds that interesting. But still, despite the fact that Cohen doesn't necessarily see a fundamental difference between prophecy and philosophy when it's done well, still he deeply believed that there was a tremendous amount of eternal truth, philosophical truth, contained in the books of the prophets. And he makes much of the idea, though, that he doesn't think the Torah was itself a philosophical treatise or written as a philosophical treatise, and the prophets weren't writing philosophical treatises. And so the prophets were not Socrates. But Cohen sees some similarities between some parts of the prophets and some of Socrates' ideas, especially his ideas about ethics. Cohen thinks that the prophets really did understand certain fundamental truths that are important for philosophical ethics. And for Cohen to read the prophets as a philosopher and to uncover those truths, for him in the 19th century to be doing that, to be reading these ancient Jewish sources and to be reading them as a philosopher and to be reading how other Jewish thinkers have interpreted them over time, that is part of a long-standing process that unfolds over history of discovering revelation, of discovering the truths that God has communicated, whatever one takes that to mean, through sacred Jewish texts. So that gives us some sense of how Cohen approached, again, the kind of revelation at Sinai, and more broadly, his conception of the relationship between philosophy and history and how revelation plays out within that.
Right. This distinction between philosopher and, let's say, the historical element, I think is an important one in Cohen's general attitude, because, as you mentioned, he had an interesting relationship with the other Jewish thinkers or Jewish scholars of his time, especially the members of the Wissenschaft des Judentums movement, on which we did an episode a couple months back, who were busy trying to historically contextualize Judaism, trying to place thinkers and ideas and trends in their correct historical context, and applying the tools of the historian and the philologist, etc., to the Jewish past. And Cohen was brought, as you mentioned, was brought up in that world, brought up in the world of the Breslau school, and certainly knew many of the impressive figures, Frankel and Gretz and others. Yet he broke from this tradition to a certain degree. Could you perhaps enlighten us a little bit as to Cohen's relationship? Because on the one hand, he was a philosopher, he was doing important work in Jewish intellectual history and relating to them, but nonetheless was not really part of the Wissenschaft school and actually diverged from them quite importantly. Could you perhaps take us through that?
Yeah, so I think Cohen's relationship to the Wissenschaft school is really interesting and complicated. But I think that it's important. You already mentioned, of course, that he was brought up in that movement, and you mentioned some of his teachers, Zachariah Frankel, Heinrich Gretz, also Bernays and Manuel Joel. These figures, he was so indebted to their approach, and in truth, methodologically, he was indebted to the very idea that he got there of reading historical Jewish sources in a very close and careful way, doing philology, reading things in their original language and examining them very closely. And he actually brought this to his philosophical work. But you're right that Cohen was interested in philosophy, and he was not interested in the very rigorous discipline of history as a kind of antiquarian discipline just on its own terms. But I wouldn't say that he was at odds with it. He wanted to expand the interest of the Wissenschaft des Judentums folks to philosophy. He wanted them to see that history was really important, but that a key part of what was important about history was the philosophical ideas that emerge over history. And it's not to say that those guys didn't see that as well. I think it's very hard to talk about all of this in like binaries. I think there's a lot of nuance in all of it. But I will say that he certainly left Wissenschaft des Judentums in the sense that he left the school and he went to German university to study philosophy. Now, I should mention here, I'm sure you heard this if you did a podcast a few months ago on this, that part of why I say he left the school and went to the university is because Wissenschaft des Judentums, the scientific academic study of Judaism, was systematically excluded from universities at this time. A lot of those figures would have been happy to operate within the framework of the German university, but they weren't able to. So they had to create their own independent institutions. But Cohen went to the university, he studied philosophy, and he really brought some of that training with him because he was deeply interested in reconciling history and philosophy. And it's interesting, his first book that made that big splash that I mentioned earlier was this commentary on Kant. And one thing that Cohen did that was really different from what anybody had really done with respect to a modern philosopher such as Kant was to do a commentary, to kind of take Kant's words and try to parse them out. And some people think that Cohen was really influenced by his Jewish education, both at the seminary at Breslau and also studying traditionally with his father in terms of bringing the notion of commentary to the study of Kant. Now, of course, there also was philosophical commentary that was done on ancient philosophical texts like Aristotle and Plato, but this hadn't really been done with respect to modern thinkers. And that was part of Cohen's revolution in the study of Kant. And so he is interested in reading Kant historically in a way that others really weren't doing. They were really playing fast and loose with the ideas without trying to really situate Kant historically in a way that Cohen was. Now, of course, this wasn't to the level that today's historians of philosophy would take seriously, but it was still an important attempt to actually bring history into philosophy and to bridge the two. And he really did believe that philosophers needed to be historians and historians needed to be philosophers, and that would be our best way of really uncovering human ideas and the true ideas that humans came up with in the past that continue to play a role in the present.
Fair enough. That's, I suppose, about as good as one can hope for, and to massively reduce a very complex issue. One final, I suppose, philosophical element of Cohen's thought that I think would be very interesting here would be tshuva, of repentance, right? And this was something that Cohen really, I suppose, a little bit unexpectedly, but at a certain point, took this and placed it perhaps not at the very center, but certainly as an important component of his overall understanding of Judaism, and really investigated it philosophically, and thought this was a topic of great sort of meaty philosophical analysis. So I suppose my question's a double header. One is, why was he so interested in tshuva? How did it function in his overall worldview? And B, not only why do you think it was important, but what did he think this concept had to say to us philosophically?
Yeah, so that's right. Tshuva, or repentance, or in the German, the term is Versöhnung, which might be better translated as reconciliation. Some have translated as atonement, but it's all kind of part of these same ideas, is extremely central to especially his last book, which was Religion of Reason Out of the Sources of Judaism, which he was still in the middle of revising when he died kind of unexpectedly in 1918. And so that book was actually published after he died, and his students really pulled it together to get the book out, but not all of it was revised or reviewed by Cohen ultimately. But still, this is considered in many ways his great work. It's certainly his great work of Jewish philosophy, and tshuva is a central idea in it. So there's a couple of different aspects of it. So I mentioned earlier some places in Cohen's thought where he thought Judaism really made a big contribution to philosophy. And one that he really worked out later in his life, in this last book especially, was with respect to tshuva. He came to think, and this is something that doesn't really appear in his earlier work, he came to think that in the relationship between God and the human being in Judaism, where particularly with respect to the ways in which the things that kind of happen on Yom Kippur in the liturgy and in the biblical texts that relate to it, where our sins are atoned for, he came to believe that if we could understand those ideas philosophically, we would see that Judaism made a tremendous contribution to philosophy in kind of originating, he thought, the idea of the individual self, who both sins, that is to say, is imperfect, and then also can have hope for improvement. Okay, and he grounds his thought on this in the book of Ezekiel, Yechezkel, and it's worth mentioning, but I can't go into detail on this, that Cohen's Hebrew name was Yechezkel, and he clearly felt a deep attachment to his namesake. And he has a very positive reading of Yechezkel, which is interesting in its own right. He sees in chapter 18 of Yechezkel, of Ezekiel, the idea that there will no longer be intergenerational punishment. And Yechezkel says that only the soul that sins can be punished. And Yechezkel talks about a father who is an evildoer who can have a son who is a righteous person, and vice versa. And he talks about the power of the individual to set their own path. And at the end, there's this call to repentance. And Cohen goes off from this with a whole philosophical understanding of the role of repentance. And you asked the question of what motivated Cohen. Why was this so important to him? And this will also speak to his understanding of how this process works. So as a philosopher, Cohen is always thinking about what is happening inside the human being. As a philosopher, especially who is committed to reason and to the human mind, he cares about theology, he cares about God, but like Maimonides, he thinks we're extremely limited in what we can know about God. And so the function that God plays is always going to be kind of vis-a-vis what we can understand is happening in the mind of the human being. He has really poignant passages in his discussion here in Religion of Reason on the human condition and on human frailty and how life is so hard and there's just so much suffering. And it doesn't really matter kind of whether you're someone who is socioeconomically well off or poor, although it does matter. And Cohen actually has a lot to say about poverty, and he cares deeply about poverty, but still he thinks the human condition affects everybody. And there's so much suffering in every human life, regardless of where you are, so many expectations that are unmet, so many ways in which we're unable to have the power to achieve our goals or our desires. I'll just mention the example. Cohen doesn't talk about this, but I'm sure this was relevant to him, that Cohen and his wife did not have children. And I'm sure this is one thing that he thought about. He was well off economically and had a very kind of, upper middle class or upper class kind of life. But still, life is hard. And he also experienced a lot of frustration, certainly, like I've already discussed, in terms of opposition to Judaism and things like that. Anyway, these are just examples. And so he begins with this as a starting point, and he wants to think about how can humans have hope about what we can have the power to have in our control. Additionally, Cohen thinks about the fact that thinkers who take really seriously ethics and virtues and morality, the moment they self-reflect, will see how imperfect they themselves are. We are all sinful creatures, whether we think about this in a theological sense or whether we just think about this in all the ways in which we're just not the best people, the best versions of ourselves that we want to be. We know all the petty thoughts that we have and all the ways in which we didn't do the thing that we know we should have done and things like that. And so he also wants to think about how can we have hope that we should undertake the endeavor of self-improvement, even though we know that we're always going to fail again and again. And so he wants us to kind of look at reality, harsh reality, both in terms of the human condition and in terms of human imperfection, and to think about how we can have hope. And he sees in the relationship to God, in the process of atonement, a central aspect of what can give us hope. First of all, we're not inheriting the sins of our ancestors, a la Ezekiel 18, so we have the ability to carve out our own path. Second of all, the fact that God is not human, and that God has the ability to kind of transcend our imperfection, and that God will forgive us. And again, what this means for Cohen is really, in a certain sense, us forgiving ourselves. It's complicated. In any case, these notions give us the ability to continue to pursue self-perfection, to continue to pursue atonement. And he thinks that the moment of forgiveness is momentary. It's this high where we have a kind of epiphany where we think like we've repented, we've imagined how we want to be our best selves, we've committed to it, and we have this kind of high where we think, okay, we're going to do this. And then inevitably, and he thinks about this, by the way, as Yom Kippur, the kind of culmination of Yom Kippur. But then we wake up the next day and we're still that same person. But now we're that person who had that experience of that epiphany. And so we know that we'll have that experience again. So these are some of the central ideas of his notion of atonement. He thinks that the very philosophical idea of a self, of a moral self who can strive towards ethical self-perfection, relies on this idea that he thinks, again, Ezekiel brought into the world. And so he thinks this is another major contribution that Judaism makes to philosophy. There's a lot more to say here, but hopefully that's a little bit understandable.
That's definitely substantial. We must get to a point which you raised a couple of times before, and I certainly want to discuss, which is Cohen's relationship to previous Jewish thinkers. And I think we'll limit ourselves to two, perhaps the two most important, namely Maimonides and Spinoza, because Cohen was very firmly in the Jewish, I would say, rationalist camp. I mean, with all its various difficulties in defining that precisely, and certainly had this intellectual inheritance, as it were, from previous thinkers such as Maimonides and to a certain extent Spinoza as well, attempting to marry reason and faith, certainly from within a Jewish context, with the Hebrew Bible, and with special attention to the difficulties thrown up by the Jewish tradition in this regard. And he had much to say about those two specific thinkers and related to them directly. So if you could perhaps give us Cohen's relationship, firstly to Maimonides, upon whom he wrote a book or essay, how exactly one calculates that, and then to Spinoza as well, to whom he had, shall we say, a not such positive relationship.
Yeah, so Cohen was very interested in Maimonides, and he read the guide. He's not just interested in the guide. I'm talking mostly about the guide. He's also interested in aspects of Mishnah Torah, philosophical aspects of it. But in any case, he read the guide with his father in the 1860s, and he continued to read it. And he saw himself as part of a philosophical tradition that began with Plato and included Maimonides and Kant and Cohen himself. And that is the tradition of philosophical idealism. So we talked about that a little bit earlier. So it can't be overstated how important he thought Maimonides was in the history of Jewish philosophy. It's worth mentioning that he read Maimonides as a Platonist and as a critic of Aristotle. That's obviously pretty different from the kind of standard reading of Maimonides as very Aristotelian. There are some good reasons for this. In the interest of time, I'm going to kind of leave that out, but happy to talk more if you think it's important. So I think I mentioned already that Maimonides' idea of God was very influential for Cohen. Maimonides understood God as just completely and utterly different from human beings, and that any way that we speak about God, that the Torah speaks about God, is always allegorical, because we really can't otherwise speak about God at all, because God is so different. And Cohen takes up this notion, what he calls the unique God, very much indebted to Maimonides, and other aspects of his thought really are clearly indebted to how Maimonides talks about God in the guide. You mentioned that he wrote a monograph on Maimonides' ethics. That was in 1908. And I'll just say as a little historical tidbit that 1904 was the 700th Yahrzeit, or anniversary, of the death of Maimonides. And all throughout kind of Wissenschaft des Judentums circles, a huge body of work on Maimonides was produced around 1904 in celebration of Maimonides' 700th Yahrzeit, and Cohen's essay was part of that. It wasn't published till 1908, but still. So the last thing I'll mention, there's so much to say, is that he read Maimonides as a deeply ethical thinker. And now there's a debate in terms of the guide about whether the guide culminates in some kind of idea of ethics and moral self-perfection towards ethics, versus whether the guide culminates in this idea of the intellectual love of God, which is much more intellectual and less ethical. Cohen was very much in the camp that the kind of perfection that is achieved at the end of the guide is a kind of ethical self-perfection. And so he was a proponent of this ethical reading of Maimonides. And in general, he was very indebted to Maimonides' understanding of the virtues. Maimonides thought that humility was an extremely significant virtue, and Cohen builds on this in various places in his work. So there's a lot more to say, but I'll leave it at that. And in terms of Spinoza, it's another fascinating topic. It was a really complicated relationship for sure, as you mentioned. In one of Cohen's earliest articles that he ever wrote, he actually expressed some appreciation for Spinoza's thought. But pretty early on, he's really a critic of Spinoza. But I would say that for most of his career, his critique of Spinoza, first of all, it's really limited to Spinoza's philosophy expressed in Spinoza's ethics, which was Spinoza's magnum opus. He had a philosophical critique of Spinoza's ethics. Spinoza's ethics has a kind of immanent God, a God who is a part of nature. Cohen calls this pantheism. It's much more complicated. I think you've had some folks on the show who have explained this better, how Spinoza is not really a pantheist and all these things. So I'll leave that out. But the reality is that Spinoza does not have a transcendent God or a fully transcendent God, and as Kant did. And Cohen came to believe that that was just a necessary premise for philosophical ethics. And in that sense, Cohen was a Kantian, and he had this critique of Spinoza. But later in Cohen's life, he comes to take up Spinoza's Tractatus Theologico Politicus, also known as the TTP. And this was not his book on ethics, but this was his book on one of his books on political theory. And it also extensively discusses the Bible and how Spinoza interpreted the Bible. From basically 1904 and onward, Cohen kind of builds up his case against the TTP and why he thinks it's such a deeply problematic text. Now, people have noted, one scholar described Cohen's monograph that he wrote about the TTP, which he published in 1915, as a hate essay, using the German term Hassaufsatz, because it's not just harshly critical of Spinoza on the content and on the ideas, but in a kind of interpersonal way. He calls Spinoza a traitor of the Jewish people. I will emphasize, though, that most of the pamphlet really is a kind of close reading of sentences from the TTP, that same style of commentary that I mentioned earlier. And some people focus more on the ad hominem stuff, leaving out the significant content as well of Cohen's critique. So I'll try to explain his criticism briefly. So just a quick reminder for folks about what the TTP was. It was a book written by Spinoza in the 17th century for contemporary political purposes, and really not meant to be a Jewish book, Jewish philosophy. He's trying to argue for the separation of church and state. He's trying to argue for freedom of inquiry and expression. And the main goal of the book is to show that philosophy is not dangerous for religion or for the state. And basically his goal is that philosophers should be free to philosophize without the constraints of religion. And it is in this context that he interprets the Bible. He interprets both the Hebrew Bible, the Jewish Tanakh, and also the New Testament. And he promises to read them on their own terms. And his main goal is to show that they are just really not books about philosophy. They're not philosophical books. And there's no opposition between philosophy and religion for this reason. So the Jews weren't his primary target, but nevertheless, he really says some negative things about Judaism when he makes this claim about the Bible as being fundamentally not philosophical or not at odds with philosophy. And again, this is more complicated. He thinks there are some philosophical ideas, but I'll leave this out. Some of the negative things that Spinoza said about Judaism sounded to Cohen's ears strikingly similar to things that he was hearing anti-Semites saying about Judaism in the 19th century. And Cohen saw Spinoza as this Jew who had been given a robust rabbinic traditional education before he was put in cherem, banned by the Jewish community in Amsterdam. He saw Spinoza as giving scientific credence to this anti-Semitism, and he just couldn't forgive Spinoza for that. He really saw it as a betrayal, and he saw it as coming from someone who should have known better. But okay, just to get to the substance of it, which I think is key here, this is the substance. Cohen disagreed with the entire premise of Spinoza's method of reading the Bible. Spinoza wanted to say that we need to read the Bible based on the Bible itself, and to kind of cut off anything that comes afterwards as taking away from our objective understanding of the text on its own terms. But Cohen really believed that this kind of approach cut off a major source of our access to truth. he really believed that we needed to understand how historical texts were received over time. And we needed to actually read the things that came afterwards and how people interpreted the Bible in order to work out some of our understanding of what the Bible meant in its own context. He doesn't think we can just look at the words themselves or their meaning. He thinks that the history of thought tells us something true about the original text itself. And I already mentioned how he thought history and philosophy needed to really work together. And he thought that Spinoza denied this relationship. And he also believed that the Bible, the Hebrew Bible, contained some philosophical truths that were really important. And so he took issue with Spinoza's rejection of the idea that there was significant philosophy going on in the Bible. So an upshot of Spinoza's discussion was a kind of negation of post-biblical Jewish history. Judaism past the biblical period. Spinoza had actually a kind of surprisingly positive view of biblical Judaism in many ways, especially the ancient Hebrew state in the time of Solomon and onward for a little bit. Okay. But he basically thinks that Judaism and its laws were made for that ancient context of that ancient state. And that once the Jews were expelled from their state with the destructions of their temples and things like that, that Jewish law doesn't have any coherent context. And he basically thought that the Jewish diaspora didn't really make sense, certainly not the continued need to observe Jewish law. Okay. Cohen, on the other hand, part of his main effort in everything that he wrote about Judaism was to redeem the diaspora experience of Judaism, to show that even after the Bible, especially especially after the Bible, Jews continued to develop Judaism in true ways that were coherent to its origins, that made a profound and necessary impact on the world and on our ability to achieve this kind of messianic ethical goal that I talked about earlier. And so he was really against this idea in Spinoza, which he also saw in his Protestant colleagues who were Bible scholars, for example, Julius Wellhausen, among others, again, of rejecting post-biblical Judaism as having anything to say to us and to our understanding of the Bible. And I mentioned earlier that we could talk about Cohen's opposition to Zionism in this context. And I'll say that I think this is central to what he worried about Zionism in its early formations in the time in which he lived. He saw Zionism as a kind of negation of the diaspora too, and as saying that where Judaism was at was when Jews lived on in the land of Israel in this biblical time, and that we need to go back to that. And Cohen saw this as dangerous and as supporting these anti-Semitic ideas that negated the rationality and the ethics and the coherence of Judaism in all those years since the year 70 of the Common Era. And so, again, that's not to say that there are reasons for Zionists today to worry about Cohen's thought, that there aren't reasons to worry about his opposition to Zionism, but it is to say that we have to understand it in its context and also in his context of this fight that he had been fighting and how he saw Zionism in his time as having these problematic bedfellows, I guess, with negating the diaspora experience.
That would that puts him in, I would say, comfortable company with many Jewish thinkers of, let's say, the late 19th, early 20th century, who were very suspicious of the resurgence of new Jewish nationalism. I suppose the last question, because unfortunately we're running low on time, has to be about Cohen's influence or subsequent influence. And there were many thinkers of the early to mid 20th century who were greatly influenced by Cohen. And it's a massive question, and we don't really have time to go into it. But for example, Franz Rosenzweig was a devotee in certain respects, and also Rabbi Joseph B. Soloveitchik wrote his PhD on the thought of Hermann Cohen. I mean, it is a very large question, but could you speak briefly to some of these influences and how Cohen's thought sort of was taken and developed and built upon in the decades following his death?
Yeah. So one thing that's important to note is that neo-Kantianism in general really fell out of favor, actually, after World War I. And this didn't just have to do with Cohen's thought. This was a broader thing. It has a lot to do with the disillusionment of the war. And philosophical winds shifted towards more existentialist ideas, phenomenology, other kinds of trends. And neo-Kantianism was seen as too rational, too optimistic, and just in general not attuned to the realities that people experienced, especially during and in the aftermath of the war. So it's something to keep in mind. Nevertheless, Cohen and neo-Kantianism continued to be hugely influential. It's just their influence was largely under the radar or denied. Many thinkers who were deeply influenced by Cohen were also people who were staunchly critical of him. And so this kind of complicates our understanding of it. But to speak to the two thinkers that you mentioned, I'm going to go in reverse chronological order, actually. So I'll begin with Rabbi Joseph B. Soloveitchik, who interestingly was kind of countercultural in that he wrote a dissertation on Hermann Cohen's thought that he completed in 1932, really at a time when Cohen and neo-Kantianism had fallen out of favor. He finished this at the University of Berlin. And he focused on the most difficult parts of Cohen's thought, maybe not surprising, his epistemology and his logic. Okay, and his own dissertation has the forbidding title, Pure Thought and the Constitution of Being in Hermann Cohen. Okay, so he clearly had a debt to Cohen, and he was interested in turning to Cohen. And he wrote about Cohen that Cohen was the most systematic and consistent thinker who wrote in the tradition of scientific idealism. And Rabbi Soloveitchik was interested in scientific idealism. He found it attractive, but he was also very critical of it in light of his own time and in light of the more existentialist influences that I mentioned as well. And so in his dissertation, he both appreciates Cohen, but he also articulates a strong critique of the relationship between thought and experience in Cohen's work. And he pushes for more experience. He thinks Cohen is too idealist, and that Cohen's idealism needs to, of course, give thought importance, but also incorporate experience, human experience more. Okay. And you kind of see this tension between a positive appraisal of Cohen and neo-Kantianism and a critique, for example, in Halachic Man, where on the one hand, it's clear that neo-Kantianism and some of Cohen's thoughts are very important for Rabbi Soloveitchik's understanding of figures like his grandfather, Rabbi Chaim of Brisk, and his understanding of halacha, or Halachic Man's understanding of halacha as approaching it akin to a mathematician with a kind of a priori and ideal construct that the Halachic Man is trying to build out of the many specific details. But at the same time, scholars have pointed out that Rabbi Soloveitchik doesn't necessarily identify with Halachic Man fully. He's certainly attracted to Halachic Man in all sorts of ways, but he also wants to incorporate more emotion and more human experience than the kind of staunch halachic men who are described have. So we see kind of both. And I would say the place where you most see Cohen explicitly in Rabbi Soloveitchik's work is in his own work on epistemology, which is Halachic Mind, where he reiterates his both appreciation and critique of Cohen's epistemology. And I guess I would say that the ability to both explicitly appreciate Cohen and also criticize him is in this time is very characteristic of his nuanced thinking. And there are other areas of his thought, I think, that are also could be said to be influenced by Cohen, some of his discussions of suffering, but it's less explicit there. So it's kind of, you have to make an argument. And then in terms of Rosenzweig, Franz Rosenzweig, who lived and died earlier, okay, so he died in 1929, Rosenzweig developed a close relationship with Cohen in the last decade of Cohen's life, so in the 1910s. And Rosenzweig is a kind of interesting figure because he never studied with Cohen at Marburg, where so many of Cohen's Jewish students went and studied with him, and their relationship kind of developed separately from that. And Rosenzweig came to have an outsized influence in how Cohen was interpreted later on. So Cohen died in 1918, and then in 1924, Cohen's Jewish writings were published as a 3-volume thing, and Rosenzweig somehow got the job of writing the introduction. And this became a kind of definitive essay on Cohen's relationship to Judaism, and Rosenzweig really argued that in Cohen's last book, Religion of Reason Out of the Sources of Judaism, that we've mentioned already, that Cohen kind of became a Baal Tshuva, talking about that concept of repentance, that Cohen repented in many ways of his neo-Kantianism, and that Cohen became a more existentialist thinker in this last book. Now, if you read Religion of Reason, you can see why Rosenzweig thinks this. There are ways in which he talks about God and the divine-human relationship that do sound more existentialist and less strict in the limits on how you can talk about God than you see in his earlier work. But many scholars think, and I really generally agree with this approach, that a lot of this language needs to be understood metaphorically, and that Cohen is not really talking about God in such a profoundly existentialist way, and that he does not reject neo-Kantianism really in this last book at all, even though he does. One thing that is new is how much he thinks religion plays a role in philosophy. This whole notion that we mentioned earlier about the human individual and how repentance or forgiveness or atonement plays a role in the moral self, that was new. But it fits better within his neo-Kantian thought than Rosenzweig really allowed. And Rosenzweig himself was really influenced by his understanding of Cohen. So Rosenzweig's Star of Redemption, which he published 3 years after Cohen's death he published in 1921, 3 years after Cohen died, he draws on so many of these ideas in Cohen that he describes as Cohen's reversal away from neo-Kantianism. And so his own interpretation of Cohen was very influential for Rosenzweig's thought. But some recent scholars have also shown that Rosenzweig is actually more neo-Kantian than he himself allows. And so there may be also other influences. But that's just a little bit on Rosenzweig. And more broadly, other figures, significant figures, were really influenced by Cohen, as you mentioned. But a lot of this influence really fell under the radar for many years.
Okay, fair enough. I think, obviously much more on that. But I suppose the very, very last thing I want to ask you before we back off is a question I asked to many of my guests, something along the lines of, if you could sit down this evening to dinner with your subject and talk to him for a few minutes, if you could corner Hermann Cohen and ask him something, what is it? What are the subjects you would broach with him, and how, what would you seek to find out from him?
That's such a big question. I think mainly I would want to see if he could clarify. I guess, honestly, I was going to say I would see if he could clarify a lot of these questions, right? Does he turn at the end of his life to a more existentialist thought, right? Is Rosenzweig right? Is the other view right? I would be really curious about clarity on those things. But I think most pressingly, honestly, for me today would be to say to him, to ask him about his position on Zionism, honestly, and to say, what would you say today? And I think that this is obviously such an important issue in our moment, and I would really be curious about how his ideas would have been revised in light of the events of the Holocaust and 1948 and onward. But I would have lots of things to ask him.
Fair enough. So I would hope, given how much time you dedicated to his work. And I suppose it is obviously a fascinating question, given that Cohen, the great philosopher, who, in many ways took a step back from viewing things in the historical context, it's obviously of great relevance to ask him, I suppose, a century or so later, to show him what has happened historically, and to ask whether his ideas would have shifted based on factors like the Holocaust, the rise of the State of Israel, and everything that's happened since. Certainly would be a tantalizing prospect. Professor Shira Billet, thank you so much for joining us today on the podcast of Jewish Ideas. This was a wonderful conversation, and I think you've done a heroic job in making one of the most difficult and complex Jewish thinkers of the last few hundred years accessible to a modern audience. And for that, we are very grateful. So thank you for joining us, and we hope to see you again soon.
Thanks. It's been a pleasure. Thanks so much for having me.
This has been the podcast of Jewish Ideas by Torah in Motion, produced by Alicia Kelman and myself, JJ Kimchi. Edited and mixed by Alicia Kelman. You can stay up to date by subscribing in your favorite podcast app. To support more thoughtful Jewish content like this, please visit torahinmotion.org/donate.